Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Adrian Swinscoe is an advisor, writer and speaker with a focus on CX and customer service. He writes regularly about CX in the business journal Forbes, and he's published several books about CX, most recently Punk CX, published last year. His book takes a different view to normal CX strategy books, so I called to ask him for some examples of what Punk CX is really about. Okay, let's go straight to the interview. Okay, thanks for being on the podcast. I saw your most recent book, Punk CX, and this is following the sort of theme that punk exploded as this do-it-yourself strategy, like a back-to-basics approach to music. And there were groups at the time like Buzzcocks that they just formed their own record label and completely bypassed the rest of the traditional industry. So how are you applying these same punk ideals to the CX industry?
So let me let me back up a little bit and tell you about the premise for the punk sort of thing, because sometimes if you don't explain the premise, then all of a sudden when you say punk, then people think about earrings and piercings and tattoos and green hair and Mohicans and lots of leather and stuff. And actually, kind of what I was thinking about is that where punk came from. Now, punk came from exploded out the back of prog rock in the 70s, almost as a bit like a reaction to how prog rock had become overly complicated, elaborate, self-indulgent in many ways, and excuse my language, in danger of disappearing up its own arse. It was more interested in its own virtuosity than it was in kind of the fans, as it were, and. Now, that doesn't mean to say it wasn't popular. It was popular, but a lot of people kind of felt kind of excluded from that. They were like going, I can't really sing along to a prog rock track. And they said, I just want to sing kind of stuff or do stuff that is meaningful, that sort of engages with me. And that's where punk came up. Punk exploded out of the back of that. So you don't need a PhD in music to be able to be in a band. You can just learn how to play or form a band and then learn how to play. As long as you can write a tune, then it's like you're fine. And it made me think. I thought about that evolution, and then I thought about prog rock, and then I thought about the service and the experience space, and it struck me that I was like, oh my God, the customer experience or customer service space is exhibiting many of the same, if not similar, characteristics as prog rock did in the 1970s, i.e., it's becoming overly complicated, certified, codified, benchmarked, frameworked, etc., like ad nauseum. It's like this industry of itself. And I think and you look at kind of stats around, some research says that between, 70% plus of all major change, digital, customer experience-led sort of initiatives are failing to meet expectations. And it just makes me feel like, given that if they're not doing that and customers don't seem to be getting happy, then it's a bit like, are they losing sight of the most important people here, i.e. the customers, and that then being a bit like kind of prog rock disappearing up their own arse, right? And then I thought, oh, okay, fine. So if the customer experience, customer service sort of space is starting to exhibit some of the same characteristics as prog rock did in the 1970s, then what would a punk version of customer experience look like? And that was the question. And I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to challenge people's thinking around what that means, what it means to be punk. What does punk mean to people? Because punk is probably one of the most, I guess, both understood but also misunderstood social and cultural and musical kind of movements of the last century. In that a lot of people kind of, like I said before, is a lot of people think about punk and they'll think, the Sex Pistols and sneering and a bit of swearing and a bit of kind of being anti-establishment and anarchy and leather and coloured hair and all that sort of like stuff. But then you take people like Pete Shelley out of the Buzzcocks, right? And if you remember kind of the first time that the Buzzcocks were on Top of the Pops, I think it was back in, was it 78, 79? I was too young at that time. I was sort of more post-punk. I was like original sort of like new wave ska, post-punk originally. And so I came to punk, pure punk kind of later. But if you remember, kind of, if you look it up on YouTube, if you search for the Buzzcocks, Top of the Pops, Ever Fallen in Love with Someone, and you look at kind of Pete Shelley, who's kind of singing, who's fronting the band, and he's got these, I don't know what it is. It's like a brown, kind of like quite like pinstripe shirt on, and some kind of like really crappy 70s kind of like stay press, kind of almost like polyester trousers. You couldn't imagine somebody who was less punk in how they were dressed, but they're making this song, or they're singing this song, which is like this punk anthem. But as you say, they loved the music, but it wasn't just the music that was punk. It was actually how they approached getting the music out there. They were like, we're going to make our own record label. And so what I'm trying to explore is this idea that punk can be anything. Is about daring to be different, and questioning things and trying to do things kind of differently in all aspects of your business, and how that can help you be better and also stand out.
So, in the CX environment then, I think we're often in danger of just following all the latest technological releases. We're always following all these trends about AI, RPA, chatbots. There's all this noise around the industry. Is your approach then is really just to sort of step back and think more deeply about what's really important?
Yeah, I believe so. Because I think that I've always had a thing where it feels like, as you say, you've got technology and this framework or that metric or whatever, and that seems to be leading the conversation, and it feels like the tail's wagging the dog, as it were. And so what I'm trying to challenge people to think about is to go, well, let's get back to basics. Let's understand what is it we're trying to do here. We're trying to create better outcomes. In the end, we're trying to create better outcomes for our customers. Now, that doesn't necessarily require that we use the latest technology. It might help, but it doesn't necessarily require it. And so what I'm encouraging people to do is to step back and go, what the hell are you doing and why? And what's the best way to achieve it? So don't be led. You kind of lead yourself, though. But by do that, by stepping back and choosing kind of what you want to do, and be willing to do things differently if that makes sense for you, for your organization, for your brand, for your team, for your customers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and I saw an interesting blog that you wrote that talks to this, because you were talking about chatbots, and you said that in 2019, the chatbots that we're using, it's all snake oil and hype. But in 2020, we're going to start seeing more pragmatism and real results. So what's changed your mind? Over the Christmas holidays then?
Well, I think so I have to thank a friend of mine, this guy called Abhinash Tripathi. He's the founder and CSO of HelpShift, because that came out of a conversation that we were having as part of my own podcast. And we were talking about this idea that, we've seen, I think last year we almost probably saw peak hype when it came to AI and chatbots. And I think the thing that's kind of changed, I don't think anything necessarily changed over kind of Christmas and New Year kind of period. I think it's more to do with, we've got to the end of almost, for many people, many organizations, a financial year. And I think what we've seen is that a lot of these projects haven't delivered. They haven't lived up to their hype, and they haven't delivered the ROI. They've been expensive. So people have been looking at it. I think there's a lot of people looking at it and just going, we need to, if we're going to make this work, we need to kind of see stuff that does work, because there's been a lot of stuff that's been overpromised but underdelivered. And that's what Abhinash and I were talking about, is the idea is that, there's a lot of experience initiatives that are getting challenged to produce, ROI. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think one is that they've almost like they've had technology that's been oversold to them or overpromised, and it's just not. And then therefore, people are trying to are feeling slightly exposed in their technology investments in terms of in organizations and what they're buying and things. But I think the second reason is that and this is a broader point, I think that many experienced initiatives are getting challenged on the ROI question, and I think many of them are getting challenges because the core business hasn't figured out why they're relevant. And I think that's one of the big problems that experience faces right now, is that if the initiatives and the investments that you're making, if they're not aligned with and set up to enable and support the achievement of the overall business's strategy, then you're going to find it hard to prove ROI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's an interesting connected point there, because I saw something that you'd written about digital transformation.
Yeah.
So, you were suggesting there that we need to stop going on about digital transformation projects and realize that your business is constantly changing. So, if that's the case and we accept that, then how do all those consultants give us a future state that we can aim for?
Again, perhaps the future consultants may end up being you'd hope that that like most things that they might move into sort of threatening conditions and they may be at risk of going out of business. However, the big consultancies are really, really good at reinventing themselves and then reselling the next thing. I think that's if they've got one brilliant skill, it's doing that. It's like spotting what's coming next. But anyway, I digress slightly. But the transformation point, as you rightly say, is that a future state that a management team can aim for. I mean, I struggle with that because I think about it almost feels like that you're aiming to finish something. But if we are truly in this era, this customer age, as it were, then it's we're never going to be finished doing this, because people change, preferences change, and therefore we've always got to adapt. I mean, this point was actually driven home to me by, and this is like a punk thing. So one of my favorite punk bands is a band called Bad Religion, and they have a song called No Control. And in that song, there is a couple of lines in the song that says, "There's no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." And I thought that was a fantastic kind of line. And so I looked it up, and actually it comes from a book that was written, I think it was in 1788, by a gentleman by the name of John Hutton. It was contained in a book called The Theory of Earth, or Theory of the Earth, which was the first recognized treatise on geology. And what this guy did, he kind of wandered across hill and dale, and down valleys and across streams and atop mountains and things, just to observe how things had evolved and how things were made. And he concluded after all these studies is that there is no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. And I think that it says a lot about, it means to me, it's like ultimately things are always going to change. And I think it's true of business. Businesses never change, never finish changing. So the idea that we're going to transform, for me, there's two parts of it. One is that, as you say, they're going to try and aspire to a finished state, which I think is kind of illusory in many ways. But I think the other thing that we don't necessarily take enough account of is the sort of language that we use to describe our business. Imagine the impact on somebody, the linguistic or psychological impact of somebody when you announce, or that senior management announces, another transformation effort. If you're a regular worker, works in the office, or work in a shop or a forecourt, or you're in a part of field service engineer corps, or whatever it might be, and somebody asks you about another, or tells you about another transformation effort. For me, there is a likelihood, might only be slim, but there's a likelihood that somebody might kind of roll their eyes and go, "Oh, not another sort of change effort." But somebody might also kind of be able to quickly translate transformation into, restructuring and possibly job losses. Now, when somebody feels threatened by that, then a lot of the time they don't necessarily get on board with it. And they tend to kind of work to protect themselves. And I think that there could be a possibility that by using some of these words to describe the things that we're trying to do, it's having, rather than it having an inspirational effect, it's actually having almost the opposite effect. If you understand what I mean.
Yeah. You're creating a lot of friction. I mean, people push back against any sort of change.
Well, they're just skeptical of it. They're looking and just going, "Oh, it's another thing," and and then their safety or their security becomes priority number one, and that just means make sure you protect yourself.
Yeah.
And that may be an underlying. It's hard to prove that, but it may be an underlying reason why some of these change initiatives, these big digital initiatives, these transformation, these experience initiatives, why they fail. And actually, there's evidence to support some of that, where there's McKinsey research that says that they've done a big piece of research a few years ago, but they continue to update it, that say that 70% of all these change initiatives tend to fail. And the main reasons they fail, you can pretty much concentrate in there's deficiencies in both their communication and training elements of those change initiatives, i.e. they've not looked after the human part of the program as well as they could, and people generally don't.
Yeah, but that's like a complete cultural change, isn't it? You need to sort of have like an acceptance that there's constant change in the business, rather than giving the project a name.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's one of those things. It's a bit like. It's like bit like being it's a bit like being an elite sportsman. You don't train just to get to a point where you can run a race and then you're finished. You have to keep training, and it's like developing new habits and behaviors and everything, and always looking for things to improve. And the only kind of time that you stop is like when you physically can't continue anymore, or you're not competitive.
Yeah.
So it is that sort of thing. It's like it's not like a quantum thing. It's not like a binary thing where it's like 0 and 1 and then you're done. And I think that's the illusion, as it were, is that you're never going to be done. So don't talk like you're going to be done, or don't act like you're going to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I know that you've argued in the past that a strategy that brands need to take is not to focus so much on generating customers, but creating fans and advocates. And we know that there's companies out there that do this very well. Nike, Harley Davidson, Apple. People pay more for their products just because they love the brand. But what if you're making washing up liquid or something that doesn't really evoke a great deal of emotion? How do you create fans of a product like that?
That's really hard, and that's a good question, kind of, Mark. And I sort of I think it comes down to sort of creativity in many ways, because how interesting can washing up liquid be? But I think it can be done, but I think it's all relative. So there's what is the brand? There's a brand in the UK. I don't know if it's the same across Europe or across parts of the other parts of the world, but there's a washing detergent enhancer for washing your clothes called Vanish. It comes in the pink tubs, and you scoop it in as an additional an add to your washing, and it's about sort of particularly around kind of colours and whites and so on and so forth. The thing that they've done, which I thought was really interesting, is that they've created fans that talk about their product, but it's not about the product, but it's about what they've figured out how to do with their product. Mm-hmm. So they've got a whole sort of like YouTube and Facebook sort of community. I think it's still going. It's been set up a wee while ago, but it's one of the ones that I've seen that I think really kind of works, is that they've found people that have been able to solve kind of really difficult washing problems to do with stains and so on and so forth, or ingrained kind of dirt, and how people, they've tapped into the creativity of their customers and then filmed them and created a whole bunch of tips and videos and all that sort of stuff, making the customers the heroes of their story. And I think that's kind of an innovative way of how even a washing detergent has been able to create its own fans in its own way. But obviously we're not talking about, they're not like sports fans, they're going to go crazy for kind of whether it works or not. Well, they might, you never know. But I think it's about interpretation. It's about understanding who you are, what you are, and what the sort of relationship you can have with your customers, and then also thinking about, well, how do we can translate that fan idea into our particular domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so imagination is generally required.
Yeah, completely.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just wrapping up then, if we're going back to the book, to the Punk CX approach, if there was one thing about this entire customer service industry today that you could change or eliminate, using this kind of punk ethic, then what would that be?
Here's one, which sort of speaks to kind of as just a challenge more than anything else, is that many organizations are going to be considering adding kind of more channels, which might be like we've talked about. It might be live chat, it might be a chat bot, it might be intelligent voice assistant, it might be all these different sort of things over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. But they also say that they want to strive for simplicity, or making their businesses kind of easy to engage with. And so the challenge is, if you're going to add a channel in the next 12 to 18 months, let's say if that's part of your plans, then ask yourself, which 2 channels are you going to retire? Because if you're not retiring 2 when you're adding 1, then you're just adding complexity to your business. Mm-hmm. And the idea of seeking simplicity it's just a lie. It's completely bunk. And all you're doing is you're dealing in complexity. But actually, we need to challenge ourselves continually around asking, why are we doing this? And what is the cost of doing this? And does it make sense? I think it's no coincidence that the leading players out there, that you might call the Apples or the Harley Davidsons or the Amazons or the Zappos or whatever, it's remarkable if you go and count them up how few channels they actually serve their customers over. Because the thing that they've got absolutely nailed is the idea is that they're focused on being great in a handful of areas rather than being average at a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But organizationally, that's hard to do because it requires us to make hard choices and say no to things, or to tell things to stop.
Yeah, and this is all getting more complex because of the smart speakers. Everybody's got Alexa at home now, and a lot of brands are trying to work out how do you get onto that platform, but it's very difficult because Alexa can only ever give one result to a search question.
Sure. But they should just stop and ask themselves, before we add that, how great are we at the things where our customers are, in the areas of where our customers are really looking for us? Mm-hmm. Just be simple, be straightforward about it, sort of thing. Is that I'm a real, and this is back to the punk sort of thing, because punk was a very, as you say, a back to basics approach, sort of thing. Really quite old, albeit quite noisy. In places, it can also be quite minimalist in terms of its approach. And what they weren't scared to do was actually to try and strip everything back. So the question you've got to ask is, are you being brilliant at the basics right now? And if you're not being brilliant at the basics, then what you end up doing is you end up building all these things on top of potentially shaky foundations. Mm-hmm. And I was just say sometimes the thing that kind of customers really appreciate is they appreciate consistency and certainty and reliability. Just do the simple things and do them really, really well. And if you can do that really well, it buys you time and license to be able to do a lot of the great stuff and the creative stuff on the top of that. But the challenge with that is that most people and most companies and most marketeers and most executives and leaders are interested in the new stuff, because actually the basic stuff takes time and discipline and commitment and hard work to get right. And that can be a bit of a grind, but that's kind of that for me. It seems a lot of the time that's can be the difference between the exceptional brands and the ones that end up being a bit flaky.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm at Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.